February 19, 1945. Iwo Jima, Volcano Islands. The first marine tanks rolled off the beaches behind the assault waves, their tracks sinking into the black sand as if the island were trying to swallow them whole. Within minutes, they were under fire from concealed 47mm anti-tank guns, knee mortar arcing from unseen pits, and the ugly thud of satchel charges that Japanese assault teams tried to slap onto engine decks. One Sherman, at the edge of the Motoyama No. 1 airfield, took a glancing hit that punched through the side plate and showered the fighting compartment with sparks. The crew braced for the old cascade of flame every Pacific tanker feared, and every Japanese infantryman expected. The fire never came. The loader kicked aside a torn amabin lid, felt sloshing fluid where the ready racks used to be, and realized the tank had taken a mortal hit that would not turn into a funeral pyre. The tank reversed, belching smoke but not fire, and minutes later rejoined the line. The men in the caves had studied American armor. For 2 years their pamphlets and field orders repeated the same lesson about Shermans: set the tank ablaze, and you empty it. The Japanese army had built a doctrine around proximity, mining, and flame, because the enemy's tank was reputed to burn easily when penetrated through the hull side near the ammunition stowage. In New Georgia and Bougainville, in the early fighting on Saipan and Tinian, many crews had learned the same lesson the hard way when Stowage M4 South took a hit and turned into a rush of flame and smoke measured not in minutes but in seconds. That reputation calcified into enemy expectation. But when the Marines and Army Armor battalions went ashore in 1945 with the W suffix in their vehicle logs, the arithmetic of survival shifted beneath the volcanic ash. Wet stowage was both a piece of plumbing and a change in geometry. The early Shermans concentrated 75mm ammunition in sponson racks high in the hull, a convenient place for the loader's hands and a catastrophic place when a side plate was perforated. A hit that penetrated the hull could ignite propellant, and once one round cooked off, the rest could follow. In 1944, American ordnance engineers introduced to interlocking fixes. First, they moved most stowage down to armored bins in the hull floor and low in the turret basket, shortening the line-of-sight exposure and putting steel and earth between incoming shot and propellant. Second, they surrounded those bins with a water-based mixture inside jackets that ruptured under heat and spill into the compartment, a wet blanket for burning propellant. The letter W on a Sherman's designation marked that the racks were the new type. It was inelegant and heavy, yet brutally effective. Post-action studies in Europe later compared burn rates in tanks penetrated by enemy fire and found that the proportion of penetrations followed by a burn fell from roughly 2/3 in dry stowage vehicles to about 1 in 6 in wet stowage ones over comparable periods, a step change rather than a tweak. Pacific conditions were different in threat mix, yet similar in what mattered most inside the hull. When a Japanese 47mm armor-piercing shot or a shape-charged lunge mine penetrated the hull, the old chain reaction often stopped at a puddle. Nothing about the Pacific forced this change. American crews in Italy and France had demanded better survivability after seeing how often penetrations produced a flash fire. But the Pacific brought its own patterns that made wet stowage decisive. Japanese anti-tank power relied less on high-velocity guns and more on close-quarter explosives. The Type 1 47mm gun could penetrate side armor at realistic combat ranges on island terrain where engagement distances were tens of meters. The Type 3 lunge mine and pole charges with shaped charge heads defeated armor by chemistry rather than kinetic energy, and did their damage in the first inches behind the plate. Both threat types put the old sponson racks in the worst possible place. By moving propellant down and cocooning it in fluid, the W Shermans denied the Japanese their most reliable second-order effect, the flame that emptied a hull and left a wreck to be finished with grenades. The first day at Iwo offered every reason for a tank to burn. Dry powder ash crept into air filters and clung to manifolds. Engines ran hot under low-speed loads, and the route inland forced tanks to work within grenade-throwing distance of pits and galleries that covered each other with enfilade fire. Mines were abundant and expertly sited, often under apparent dead ground or the only gap between concrete The Marine tank battalions used dozer-blade Shermans to carve lanes for others. And in those lanes the enemy waited with pole charges and satchel bundles designed to detonate at the intake louvers or the turret ring. The crews had sandbags, welded applique, and makeshift steel skirts, but those were defenses against penetration and spall. The wet stowage was the unadvertised defense against what came after. Numbers recorded after the battle showed that many disabled Shermans did not burn unless hit repeatedly in the same place or immobilized and set on fire externally with fuel or demolition charges. That did not make these tanks invulnerable, it made them recoverable. Recovery in turn recycled combat power at a rate that Japanese planners had not budgeted into their attrition logic. To understand why that caught the enemy by surprise, it helps to rewind to 1943 and 1944, when most Japanese units first faced Shermans in numbers on Saipan and Tinian. The M4 variants present then were still predominantly dry stowage. When a 47mm gun tucked into a retaining wall hit a side panel at 70 or 80 meters, the result was often fire. That trained an army's instinct. Japanese infantry manuals honed in on the contour of the Sherman's flanks and the roof of the engine deck. They taught men to aim satchel charges for the grills, to drive lunge mines into the lower side hull in front of the rear bogie, where armor was thinner and the sponson above held ammunition, and to accept that they would likely die igniting a machine that would then be useless. The effectiveness of those methods was high enough on those islands to justify the sacrifice in the logic of the defenders, who saw tanks as breaching tools for infantry and believed that burning a few would stall assaults, while artillery and mortar worked the lanes. When the same techniques yielded fewer flaming wrecks on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, it felt less like a marginal shift in enemy equipment and more like a betrayal of the physics they had learned by blood. Wet stowage did not change the silhouette or the sound of a Sherman. Japanese observers could tell the difference between 75mm and 105mm. Assault gun variants by muzzle diameter and new, the stubby gun, signaled a demolition roll. They noted HVSS suspensions and occasional field modifications. But the letters appended to factory paperwork meant nothing inside a cave. Intelligence on American production changes moved slowly into the island garrisons. The supply chain into the Marianas and Volcano Islands was one-way and thin. Units received ammunition and food with decreasing regularity after 1944, and rarely received fresh technical literature. Even if a staff officer on Formosa had read an enemy report about reduced burn rates, there was no path to retrain a bunker team on Iwo in February 1945. Japanese troops faced an enemy tank that looked familiar and behaved differently at the moment that mattered most to survival. On the American side, the technical change unlocked small tactical habits that compounded. Infantry in the Pacific had learned to hesitate near a knocked-out tank because a Sherman that burned was a magazine with a chimney, and the heat cooked off single rounds for minutes. With wet stowage, when a tank was knocked out without internal fire, or was immobilized but cold inside, infantry squads could use it as cover immediately. In the brutal geometry of Iwo's terraces and parapets that changed movement by meters that saved lives, maintenance detachments found they could tow a higher fraction of casualties in the hours before nightfall, when Japanese infiltrators made every stranded vehicle a death trap. In numbers, this meant that a battalion that landed with, say, 48 tanks could expect to retain a larger fraction on day 3 and day 5, even after severe fighting. In an island campaign where replacement tanks arrived late, if at all, and the outcome of a breach turned on weather, 4 tanks or 9 lead a company at dawn. Survivability that showed up as persistence on the roster was an operational variable. If wet stowage were merely a European theater footnote, these Pacific consequences would be anecdote. The record says otherwise. The Marines tank companies on Iwo Jima, and later on Okinawa, fielded significant numbers of M4A375W, and related W variants by 1945, particularly where Army logistics supported Marine formations with late production vehicles. In parallel, Army armored battalions ashore in the Philippines and on Okinawa also brought wet stowage. Shermans into fights where ambush range was often under 100 meters, and the worst enemy of the tank was a man, with a shaped charge in a trench beneath him. Here the same engineering that saved crews in the Bocage, when Panzerfaust bit into side plates, saved crews in the Pacific, when a lunge mine head punched through with a narrow jet. The liquid jackets ruptured, poured, and smothered. The low racks kept propellant out of line with the jet, and the fire that doctrine anticipated did not erupt. While exact theater-wide percentages are hard to assign because Pacific losses skewed toward mines, terrain immobilization, and demolition by friendly forces to prevent capture. Unit logs repeatedly note penetrations without internal fire in W tanks that previously would have flamed. The statistical picture from Europe is clearer because of the volume of data and consistent post-battle analysis, and that pictures ratios provide a sober bracket for what crews felt on the sand and coral. For Japanese planners in fortified zones, the enemy's tanks were supposed to be the single most brittle piece of the assault. Technically powerful, but morally weak once lit, that judgment drew on their own experience building a tank arm for China and Southeast Asia, where light vehicles dominated and ammunition stowage was an afterthought so long as the enemy lacked penetrating guns. Their best available anti-tank gun, the 47mm, arrived late and in insufficient numbers and had to be carefully sighted to protect its crews. Their infantry, courage, and ingenuity compensated, at least on paper, by accepting that a man could trade his life to destroy a tank. Even when wet stowage denied the expected result the first time, doctrine did not permit retreat from the trench. Assault teams tried again. Many did destroy tanks by piling charges into air intakes, or levering a shaped charge head against the belly at a culvert. Wet stowage did not save crews when hull plates were peeled back and fuel ignited. It did interrupt the straightforward sequence in which any penetration anywhere on the side meant a roar of flame. That is what made it a surprise across the caves. You could wound the tank and watch it drive away. You could stop one and see its crew dismount alive. You could riddle the flank and still not get the torch that signaled victory to nearby infantry. Surprise in war is often psychological before it is statistical. On Okinawa, the terrain made the lesson explicit. The collection of positions the Americans called the Shuri Line forced tanks to climb and nose over into kill zones, measured in tens of meters where every rock concealed a slit, and every slit an explosive head. The 24th Marines and Army formations fighting alongside them used assault sections of tanks and flamethrowers to dig out individual positions under machine gun and mortar fire. Damage to armor was constant and cumulative, the sort of fight where any top deck hit with flaming fuel could render the vehicle unusable, even if no one was wounded. In daily maintenance tallies, a pattern emerged. Many vehicles came back with welded patches, replaced external stowage, and scorched paint. Yet their interiors were intact and their ammunition did not cook. Those were hours saved and crews preserved for the next grind forward. Survivability did not shorten the battle. It simply made the American slope of attrition shallower than the Japanese had modeled. None of this means the Sherman shed its reputation overnight among its own crews. Men who had watched a friend's tank go up in 1943 did not unlearn fear because a letter W sat in the tech manual. Marine and Army tankers on Iwo still stacked sandbags and steel track on hull sides. They still fought with hatches cracked and extinguishers ready. They still dreaded the dull thump of a lunge mine on the side of the hull. What wet stowage did was change the odds enough that many who would have died in 1944 lived in 1945. It also changed how infantry worked with tanks. On deep lust days, Marines used immobilized but unburned tanks as platforms for flamethrower teams and covering fire, hunkering behind armor that would have been a furnace months earlier. The enemy's expectation that any hit would create a catastrophic fire no longer held, and that freed American officers to plan assaults in which the tank line could absorb punishment, then repair, then return. The fuel for this shift was industrial discipline far away. The ordnance decision to re-engineer stowage and accept the weight and volume penalty came from months of casualty analysis and test-range replication of battle damage. The water-jacketed racks were not glamorous. They added plumbing and maintenance points and demanded training to refill and inspect seals. They also required production changeovers and a coordinated flow, so that vehicles with the new layout reached units that needed them most. By late 1944, those vehicles were arriving in both theaters. The European data banked the statistical proof quickly because engagement volumes were high and enemy anti-tank power was concentrated in Panzerfaust ambushes and 75mm to 88mm gunfire that either did not hit or hit hard. The Pacific collected proof more slowly, in oil-streaked notations across battalion logs, each entry a penetration. No fire, or a hit, crew okay, that deviated from the previous year's rhythm. Japanese observers in caves could not see the plumbing or the low bins. They could only observe an enemy tank that remained in the fight more often after a hit. That observation is a kind of intelligence, but the war did not grant them time to build a new doctrine on it. It would be simple to say wet stowage alone made the difference. The truth is layered. The Japanese garrisons in 1945 were starving and short on artillery. Their 47mm guns ran out of ammunition. Many lunge mine heads were present without enough men or cover to deliver them. American infantry and engineers honed bunker reduction tactics to a ruthless efficiency by the time they hit Iwo and Okinawa, and naval gunfire and airstrikes rearranged the map before tanks moved. Yet inside this stack of variables, the fact that a penetrated Sherman did not usually become a pyre altered the exchange. An island fight is a logistics race with cliffs. Each tank that lived to be pulled back and patched protected the assault schedule more than any planning chart predicted. Each crew that stepped out alive preserved experience that no replacement pipeline could accelerate. Against an enemy counting on fire to break tempo, the absence of fire was the decisive technical asymmetry. The Japanese did adapt at the edges. Reports from Okinawa emphasized deliberate targeting of tracks and suspension to immobilize tanks for later demolition, and the use of smoke and terrain to isolate vehicles from supporting infantry. They continued to tunnel deeper to protect guns from counterfire, and worked to draw tanks into V-shaped ambushes where multiple satchel teams could converge. The results were often deadly. Wet stowage did nothing for a tank belly blown open by a large mine, or a turret jammed by a shaped charge at the ring. But even those tactical adjustments carried a cost. Immobilizing rather than igniting meant the Americans often recovered the hull at night and returned it, patched, the next day. In a campaign measured by weeks in which every tank lost permanently had to be replaced by one from a landing ship that might be 1,000 miles away, that distinction mattered. When the fighting ended on Okinawa in June 1945, tank battalions compiled lessons learned. They did not write poetry about water jackets. They wrote that internal ammunition fires after penetration were less frequent in the newer Shermans, that survival times inside a hit vehicle were longer, that crews had a better chance to fight the fire, bail out, or even continue the mission. They recorded that infantry cooperation improved as crews and riflemen learned that a knocked-out tank would not always detonate behind them. They noted that Japanese assault methods remained dangerous, and that no engineering inside a hull could substitute for suppressive fire and careful route clearance. Yet the thread is clear. The W suffix that no Japanese soldier could see was written into the casualty curves that Japanese officers could not stop. That asymmetry is what the title of this story names. The troops in those caves were brave and skilled and often fatalistic, but they were fighting a different Sherman than the one that had burned on Saipan, and they did not imagine how the Americans had changed it because there was nothing to see from a slit but a shape and a sound. The legacy of wet stowage outlived the islands. Post-war armor design kept ammunition low and separated it from crew spaces where possible, later adding blow-off panels and armored doors that vented energy outward. The idea that ammunition, location, and compartment design could change survival odds as much as raw armor thickness became accepted practice. In the microcosm of 1945 island assaults, the same idea took a simpler form. Move the powder where the first inches of penetration could not reach it. Surround it with a fluid that smothers flame. And write a letter on the tank's designation that the enemy would never read, but would feel in the way battles unfolded. Iwo Jima's opening day offers the image worth keeping. A tank takes a hit, and the crew flinches for a fire that does not come. The loader's boots splash where dry metal used to be. The driver backs out of the killing lane, and the tank returns later with a new plate welded over the hole. Somewhere in a cave, a soldier waits for the next vehicle to burn and mark success in orange. It does not. Tempos accumulate. Breaches hold. The battle advances by yards that add up to the runway, and the ridgeline, and the end of organized resistance. There is a tendency in popular memory to reduce the Sherman to a caricature, either a death trap or a miracle of industrial war. Neither survives contact with the record. The Sherman was a compromise, optimized for the fight America thought it would have, then adapted under fire. Wet stowage was one of those adaptations, born in Europe and decisive in the Pacific for reasons that mattered on contact. It did not make tanks invincible. It made them less likely to kill their own crews after an enemy had already done his part. To the men in the caves, that was not just an engineering footnote. It was a violation of expectation that bent the curve of a campaign they meant to fight by burning the enemy's machines as they crested each terrace. When those machines kept working or were repaired and returned, the mathematics of defense failed. By the summer of 1945, the Japanese army had few illusions left about American material ingenuity. But at the level of a bunker team waiting for a Sherman to flame when struck, the surprise never entirely faded because it was renewed with every penetration that produced smoke and not fire. Warfare is built on habits of thought, hardened by experience. The experience that Shermans burned was true until it wasn't. The water jackets and lower racks that made it untrue arrived without ceremony, and were not accompanied by a change in silhouette or a boast across a loudspeaker. They announced themselves only by what did not happen in the seconds after a hit. On a battlefield, where men judged success by whether a tank became an inferno, absence was the loudest message of all. As we approach the end of our remembrance today, we're grateful you listened to this full story with us, and we're glad our archive has nourished your heart and soul. War stories have probably also marked your family's life in some way, haven't they? Maybe you wore the uniform yourself, or perhaps someone you loved did. Your father, a grandfather, or even an uncle. If so, we'd like to invite you to add another chapter to this record. Share with our community a war story that resonates in your family in the comments below. It could be a family tale, a saved letter, a lesson learned on a flight line, or in a muddy field. Anything you want. Tell us from where and what time are you listening to this message. This contribution helps to grow and keep our community together. We can't let these incredible stories be lost in time. The World War II Archives channel was created to honor and preserve these memories. Finally, if this resonates with you, we invite you to subscribe and perhaps share it with a friend who also recognizes the importance of these tales. Stay tuned so you don't miss the next one of our lost archives yet to come.